Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse the poem Walking Away by C.D. Lewis. Please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Now, as you know by now, when we look at these poems we look at the poet, but we just try to find information from the poet's life that helps us to understand the particular poem we're looking at. And actually in Walking Away is a very personal poem from C.D. Lewis, and really just describing a particular moment in his life, so we don't need to know a lot of contextual detail to understand the poem, but I will just cover a couple of the basics for you to think about. Born in April 1904, died in 1972, born in Ireland but only stayed in Ireland for a couple of years and then was raised in the UK. C.D. Lewis was the professor of poetry at Oxford in the 50s and published Walking Away, the poem we're looking at today, in a 1962 collection. He was the Poet Laureate from 1968 to 1972 when he died, and interesting bit of trivia is the father to Daniel Day-Lewis, the very famous actor, although this poem is about his son Sean, so it's not something we'll write about in our analysis. Now, Walking Away comes from the 1962 collection The Gate, and this collection covers a wide range of topics: religion, politics, love, family. So even in his collections of poetry there's not really one overarching theme, although Walking Away is certainly the most well-known and well-respected poem in the collection. Let's have a little think about the literal translation. Do you remember your first ever day at school? I do, and this picture here is the playground of Plaistow Hill Infant School. I had my first day at school there 30 years ago, and I still remember it exactly, and I'm sure you're the same. Well, the poet is thinking back to the first day at school for his son Sean, and how he took him to school, how Sean played a bit of football before school began, and how then his son Sean went into the school building. And 18 years later, the poet is still thinking about it. So it's a very significant moment in the poet's life. Let's look at the poem, and I'll give you a quick literal translation. It is 18 years ago, almost to the day, a sunny day with leaves just turning, the touchline's new rules since I watched you play. Your first game of football, then like a satellite, wrenched from its orbit, go drifting away. So what's he saying here? He's saying, well, almost exactly 18 years ago, when summer was turning into autumn, everything at school was set up afresh. They'd repainted the lines on the football pitch, and I was watching you play your first game of football, and then painfully you drifted away. Behind a scatter of boys, I can see you walking away from me towards the school with the pathos of a half-fledged thing set free into a wilderness, the gait of one who finds no path where the path should be. So this is actually continuing the sentence from stanza 1, a bit of enjambment which we'll analyse in a second. But what he's saying is, so you drifted away behind a group of boys, and now, even now, 18 years later, I can picture it. You were walking away from me towards the school. You seemed sad. It was like you were set free but not ready. In an unsafe world, you walked as if you were unsure of where to go. The hesitant figure, eddying away like a winged seed loosened from its parent stem, has something I never quite grasped to convey about nature's give and take, the small, the scorching ordeals which fire one's irresolute clay. Gets trickier, this poem, doesn't it? So, you were hesitant. You were floating away from me like a seed, separating and flying away from the plant. And I can never quite understand, I can never quite get my head around how nature gives and takes, how painful experiences make you stronger and make you independent. I have had worse partings, but none that so gnaws at my mind still. Perhaps it is roughly saying what God alone could perfectly show, how selfhood begins with a walking away, and love is proved in the letting go. So what's he saying here? I've had more horrible experiences of saying goodbye than this, but none of them are still so stuck in my mind. And perhaps it's only God who can give up a son. How you can only become your own person, I realise now, when I let you go. And that is what love is. So, a fairly simple poem, lots and lots of imagery and metaphor. In terms of the love and relationships cluster, the poem looks at the parent-child relationship, and as a result you might want to consider comparing it with Follower by Seamus Heaney, or Mother Any Distance by Simon Armitage, or Climbing My Grandfather by Andrew Waterhouse, or Before You Were Mine by Carol Ann Duffy. Now that's quite a lot of options, so to be more precise, we can say the poem explores the sacrificial nature of parental love, and that might make it compare well with Before You Were Mine. There's also an exploration of how relationships change over time. There's a sense of shock for the father who can't quite let go of his son, but has to accept that the relationship is changing, and his son is growing up. And this makes for a good comparison with Mother Any Distance. So what do we do when we have two ideas about how a poem covers a theme? Well, we look at the language, the structure and the form, we see what the poet is doing there, and then we think about which theme best fits the poet's techniques. And in my belief, in my opinion, in this video then, what we're going to look primarily at is how the father is struggling to let go of and accept the changing nature of the relationship he has with his son. Let's start by looking at the use of structure. Lots of things on the screen, I'll talk through them all one by one. So the poem is written in quintets. Each stanza contains 5 lines, and this is a very ordered and controlled structure, which perhaps reflects the control the father has had over his son up to this point in the poem, and the control he still wants to have, hence his frustration at letting go. As we'll explore in the language analysis section, the father has been the constant, steady force that the son has had in his life, and this is changing. Now, this steadiness of the father is backed up with the use of the rhyme scheme, which is again consistent throughout A, B, A, C, A. So the first line rhymes with the third and the fifth, and then the rest, the B and the C, do not rhyme. So there's a very tightly controlled rhyme scheme and a very tightly controlled stanza length, and I would say that that symbolises the father's wish to tightly control the life of his son. That's why this moment is so hard for him. He has to let go. He has to, as the title says, walk away. But there are some contradictions to that, and that's what I love about poetry. There's one thing you can see which suggests something, but then there's something which challenges that. So what about the use of enjambment, where sentences continue onto other lines and even other stanzas? We see the enjambment, I mentioned it earlier, between the end of stanza 1 and the beginning of stanza 2. And it says, wrenched from its orbit, go drifting away behind a scatter of boys. But not only does the sentence continue on to the next line, it continues on to a whole different stanza. That's what enjambment is. The enjambment then signifies a shift in the relationship, a change, as the son goes off with the other boys. And similarly, there's caesura, use of punctuation to pause or stop the reader mid-line. We see an example with the full stop after other boys. So we could say that the use of enjambment and caesura are structural features which challenge the idea of control that the father has. It challenges the control of stanza length and rhyme scheme. So the enjambment and caesura reflect how the father is losing control. His son is beginning the journey to independence, and the father wants the tight control, but the poem refuses to give it to him in the stop-start caesura, the messy structural enjambment. So there's a great way that we can just analyse structure and see the conflict, the inner conflict of the father, because he knows it's the right thing to do to let his son go, and we'll talk about how that's presented through imagery in a second, but also he's struggling to let his son go. And that conflict between tight control and lack of control is reflected through the rhyme scheme, the 5-line stanzas, the caesura and the enjambment, and they're all structural features. And it's always good to write about structure because most students don't. Now, let's have a little think about the ending. A lot of poems have cyclical structures. They start where they ended, they end where they started, or they have no sense of conclusion. But this poem does have a sense that the speaker has learned to accept the lack of control. And structurally, the poet reaches a conclusion with the final 2 lines, how selfhood begins with a walking away and love is proved in the letting go. It's the sort of moral of the poem. And these lines at the end show that the father has at least partially learned to let go and accepted the change which has taken place. So the fact that this penultimate line, the second to last line, is also containing the title of the poem, highlights its importance. The message of the poem is the importance of letting go. But it's not easy for the father to accept this, and we see the struggle that the father goes through in a lot of the images. Let's have a look at one of the images, which is this idea of like a satellite wrenched from its orbit. It's a simile of danger. A satellite is supposed to orbit, so we see in the picture here, for example, a satellite orbiting around the Earth, and that's what it's supposed to do. So if it's taken out of its orbit, something has gone wrong, something is dangerous. Now we see also there is enjambment in the poem. The quotation actually ends, the line changes after the word satellite. And the enjambment here is quite clever, isn't it? Because it wrenches the sentence apart, just like the satellite is being wrenched out of orbit, and just like the father and son are being wrenched apart. And this use of enjambment to actually signify when something is separating or changing or turning is what we see in a number of poems like Follower, with the turn of the plough being an example of enjambment as well. So there's negative language as well with the use of the word wrenched, and I'm going to come back to that, but I want you to think about the significance of that verb wrenched. It shows how his father hates this. And in a poem that's filled with so much imagery of nature, the image of a man-made object, a satellite here, refers to perhaps how the speaker feels that this is not a natural break, this is a forced man-made break, represented by the imagery of a man-made satellite. That's how he feels at the beginning. It's important to remember that stanza 1, things change, and a lot of those changes are represented through the imagery. The poem is filled with really rich imagery of metaphor and simile, and you would expect that for a memory which is so important to the poet that he still feels it clearly after 18 years. But when a poem contains lots of metaphors and images, there is a risk that we just try to work out what they mean. But we need to focus our analysis on the idea that we're exploring. So the difficulty in letting go of a loved one, the notion that it is the right thing to do but it's painful, is what we're looking at here. The conflicting emotions in this relationship of not wanting to let go but knowing it's the right thing. So let's look at some of the images in relation to that. The first is the beginning, a sunny day with the leaves just turning. Now in literal terms, the poet is talking about autumn here, the season of autumn. It's probably September, because that's when school starts. He's taken his kid to school, and the leaves are turning brown on the trees. So it's just a literal description. But there is, of course, a deeper meaning. The poet will often turn to the imagery of nature to help him understand the situation that he's in. And in this case, autumn reflects the transition in the son's life. His son is entering a new season. And with that comes the pain of the father. The leaves turning, dying, dropping off, going brown, reflects the sense of loss and pain felt by the speaker. But it's a natural image. It's an image of nature, so it suggests that the speaker understands that it's the right thing to do, it's the natural thing to do, it's the thing that is ordained by life itself, but it's also painful, reflected through the dying leaves. The next one is the touchline's new ruled. In literal terms, the speaker is thinking about how when they've gone to the school on the first day, the caretaker has clearly painted on the white lines on the pitch, brand new for the new year. But again, there's a deeper meaning. We can see the image as reflecting the way that the new boundaries, because that's what touchlines are, they're boundaries, aren't they? There are new boundaries and regulations being put in place in the father-son relationship, and the father has to come to terms with them. Continuing with nature imagery, Day-Lewis uses the bird metaphor of half-fledged. Now, fledged means when a young bird's wing feathers are large enough so it can fly. And the use of half-fledged suggests that the speaker, the father, doesn't feel like his son is ready. Now this is very similar to Simon Armitage's Mother Any Distance, which refers to more nest imagery of fall or fly. So the bird nest imagery, which we see on the screen here, is really important. When a bird hatches in a nest, at first all it does is eat the food it's brought from its parents. But at some point the bird has to get up and fly. And that's a risk because it jumps out of the nest, and there's only one shot, as Eminem would say. The bird's going to jump out of the nest and begin falling to the ground, and if it doesn't quickly work out how to fly, it's probably going to die. And the speaker is acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. He feels that his son isn't ready. But again, the use of natural imagery reflects how he accepts that it is the right thing, the natural thing to do. By stanza 3, however, we get the sense that the father is starting to accept the changing nature of the relationship. You remember in stanza 1, we had satellite wrenched. Now, satellite is a man-made object and not a natural object. The word wrenched is a verb which is aggressive and sounds very negative. But we move in stanza 3 to the image of like a winged seed loosened. Now, there's a lot we could talk about this. It's a really interesting image. It's a move to natural imagery. Okay, so it's gone from a satellite to a winged seed, which suggests the changing of thinking of it being man-made and unnatural to sort of the right thing to do. The word wrenched, which was used with the satellite, the verb wrenched has now moved to a much softer verb of loosened, which reflects how the father is coming to terms with it. And the winged seed itself is an interesting choice because it's clearly designed, it's made, and it is destined to fly away from its parent stem. Whereas the satellite is not supposed to leave its orbit, the winged seed is supposed to leave its parent stem. And it again reflects a shift into acceptance of what is happening is right and it is natural. So, what else? This is just an image that I think is quite complex, so I want to explain it just because many of you might not get what's going on. The scorching ideal ordeals which fire one's irresolute clay. Now here the poet is referring to the process of fire turning clay into a pot. Have you ever made something out of clay in school? That you make it and then it has to go in the kiln. And what does a kiln do? You can see one on the screen here. It fires up and cools down, and the changes in temperature make the clay change. They make some quite profound changes in the clay. It goes from this soft, fragile substance to one which is rock hard, impervious to water, wind and time. In other words, it's a hard process, but it makes it stronger and more able to survive. And that again is a metaphor for how difficult experiences make us grow up into independent people. The poet's metaphor shows he knows it is ultimately a good thing for his son, but the use of such painful language such as scorching, wrenched and gnaws show how it's traumatic, perhaps more so for the father. So again there's this acknowledgement that the distancing relationship is a good thing, with the outcry of pain and frustration too. A very honest poem. And then in the final stanza we have a reference to how God alone could perfectly show that love is proved in the letting go. Now to understand this we need to know the Bible. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world he gave his only Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life." The story of the Bible is that God created man to have relationship with God and man in relationship, but then man sins and ignores God and moves away from God. Now God is perfect and cannot be around sin, so the relationship between God and man is broken. But what God does is he gives his son Jesus to come to the earth, to die on the cross, to pay the price for our sins. So the forgiveness is bought by Jesus. Now Jesus is God's son, and with the forgiveness that comes through Jesus in being a Christian, we can now come back into relationship with God. So religious imagery of God here sacrificing his son shows that it is the hard thing to do, but it is the right thing to do. It is the sacred. There's been a lot of natural imagery, now we're having religious imagery, that it is the sacred, the godly, the morally right thing to do. So to conclude, we have a poem which explores the changing nature of a relationship, doing so with a mixture of positive and negative feelings towards those changes. Please do give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, check out my ebooks at mrbruff.com, and thanks for watching.